Hello class, we're back again with another lecture. Today we're going to start the lecture series on the doctrine of God. Theology proper really is the study of who God is. It's knowledge about God. We're going to be looking today at the immanence and transcendence of God, and then we're going to begin looking at divine attributes, and that will carry over into the next video lecture. I want to read to you from Jeremiah chapter 23, verse 24 this morning. Can a man hide himself in hiding places so that I do not see him, declares the Lord? Do I not fill the heavens and the earth, declares the Lord? This text reminds us of God's transcendence and his immanence together. Here's a definition of divine immanence. God is present and active within his creation and within the human race, even those members of it that do not believe in or obey him. That is from Erickson. Here is his definition of transcendence. God is not merely a quality of nature or of humanity. He is not simply the highest human being. He is not limited to our ability to understand him. His holiness and goodness go far beyond, infinitely beyond ours, and this is true of his knowledge and power as well. So on the one hand, God is immanent in that he is active and involved in creation. On the other hand, he is transcendent in that he exceeds and goes beyond what we can even comprehend or imagine. So here are implications of divine immanence. First, God may work through mediate means to accomplish his purposes. What do we mean by that? God may use other things to accomplish his purposes. The Bible, for instance, stresses that we all have an appointed time of death. God may use illness, accident, any number of ways to bring about that time of our final demise. And the same is true in every aspect of his work. God has a purpose to save sinners, but he doesn't do it apart from the preaching of the gospel. He doesn't do it apart from the witness of believers. He doesn't do it apart from the work of the church. He doesn't do it apart from the conviction of the Holy Spirit. He works through all these different means to accomplish his purposes. Secondly, God may use non-Christian persons and organizations. We see this in the Old Testament with the different kings that God used. God calls Cyrus his anointed for bringing the people back from the Babylonian exile, even though Cyrus was not a follower of the God of Israel. It reminds us that we ought to appreciate all of God's creation. God made all of this. He worked to make all of this. And we should appreciate it, we should care for it, we should remember that God has placed us here as stewards of creation. It reminds us that knowledge of God is available through creation. We can see his handiwork in the world around us, in the universe, in the skies, in the heavens, in the design of our very bodies. We can see the handiwork of God. God is present and active in every human life to some degree, making it possible for the gospel to connect with every person. In some way, God is connected to and involved in the life of every person who lives. But what are the implications then of God's transcendence? First of all, there is a higher being than humans. We are not the top of the food chain. Secondly, our conceptions of God are limited and not comprehensive. We are finite and he is infinite. We cannot comprehend him in all that he is. Thirdly, salvation is not the result of our efforts, but of God's work on our behalf and in us. Well, we don't make salvation happen for us. God comes down and makes it happen. Fourth, there is an ontological difference between God and his creation that will always exist. In other words, in ultimate reality, God will always be uniquely distinct and different from all that is created. We will not become God at some future point. That simply is not possible. We will always even in a glorified and resurrected state, still be finite human beings. In our worship, then, we must maintain a sense of reverence and never treat God too familiarly or as an equal, and certainly not as our servant. You know, it's very popular to use phrases like the man upstairs, or that is entirely inappropriate when speaking of God. It has become altogether cliche to treat God as if he's the one we just go to when we need something. That's not why God created us. Lastly, we ought to look for and expect God's transcendent working in the world and in our lives. In other words, we ought to look for and expect the miraculous. We ought to look for and expect to see God's hand in providence. When you think you're running late for something, only to realize later that you avoided being in an accident because you were running late. That's the hand of God. And so be mindful of that God is working in the world and in our lives. So let's talk next about divine attributes. We want to talk first of all about the nature of God's attributes. Erickson defines it this way: attributes are qualities of the entire Godhead. In other words, they are equally applicable to God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. Secondly, they are permanent. They do not go away. They are eternal. They have, like God, no beginning and no end. They are intrinsic and essential. They cannot be in any way separated from who God is. And fourth, God is incomprehensible in the sense that we cannot know or understand him fully and completely. So how do we classify the attributes? Different approaches, different models have been suggested. Various approaches have been used through the centuries. Some of them involve simply dull intellectualism, categories and memorization that just translates into boring stuff. What is more helpful is worshipful contemplation. One of the things that will enliven and strengthen our worship is if we are mindful of the divine attributes as we worship. So, what are some different ways of arranging the divine attributes? Well, E.Y. Mullins, early 20th century Southern Baptist, arranged the divine attributes and divided them between moral attributes and natural attributes. Karl Barth, German neo-Orthodox theologian of the 20th century, divided them between God's holiness and God's love. The traditional Reformed approach has been to speak of them as incommunicable, that is, attributes that pertain exclusively to God and cannot be shared, such as his omnipresence, the fact that he is everywhere at once, and communicable attributes, attributes he may share in some way with his creation, such as the attribute of mercy or the attribute of holiness, where God makes us holy. Schaeffer divides them into attributes of constitution and attributes of personality. A.H. Strong divides them into absolute attributes. He was an American Baptist theologian in the early 20th century. Absolute and relational. And David Dockery, following similar to what Millard Erickson does, divides them between God's greatness and God's goodness. Some useful books in this regard: Wayne Grudem's Systematic Theology, Stephen Charnock, The Existence and Attributes of God, and A.W. Pink, The Attributes of God. These are some excellent books that you might consider reading on the divine attributes. There are, in Erickson's division, there are natural attributes. These are non-moral superlatives. These are attributes of God's greatness that don't have a moral component particularly, but they're things like his being almighty, his being all-knowing, his being all-present, these kinds of things. Then there are the moral attributes. They are related to God's righteousness, his love, his justice, his mercy, his wrath, these things. So Erickson divides between God's greatness and God's goodness. He avoids a dichotomy of opposites in God's attributes, where one group of attributes is posited against another. And so that is a breakdown of the classification of divine attributes. In the next lecture, we will get into specific attributes of God.